Welcome, everyone. My name is Furchtgott-Roth. I will be your host today. Thank you so much for joining us here at the Hudson Institute and the Center for the Economics of the Internet. Before we get started, just a quick mention of two upcoming events. On April 30th, we have Commissioner Noah Phillips of the Federal Trade Commission. And then on May 3rd, we have Professor Jonathan Baker of American University with a new book on antitrust. But today, we are delighted to have with us David Redl, Assistant Secretary of Commerce for NTIA, and a job title that I think may be about the longest in the federal government. David is like me, an alum of the House Energy and Commerce Committee, and he has gone on to great things. We are just delighted to have you here today. David is the administration's point person on telecommunications policy and is incredibly knowledgeable about a great many things, but I think most importantly, he is one of the, I think, most articulate speakers in Washington on telecommunications policy. And when I ask him a question, he is going to give the most profound answers, and so
I usually like to underpromise and overdeliver, Harold. You're setting me up for failure here.
Oh, well, see, there you go. Not everyone here is deeply versed in how telecommunications policy is formulated in Washington. Why don't you tell folks a bit about NTIA and how that fits into the administration, into telecommunications policy, and tell us about just generally how this fits into everything.
Sure. Well, first of all, thanks for having me. I'm sorry that I managed to make a 2-block walk into a 20-minute escapade, but I'm glad to be here. And NTIA, for those that aren't familiar, is a 40-year-old agency, which by the federal government's terms is a baby agency. But we were founded during the Carter administration by an executive order and later codified by Congress. And our roles have evolved over time, but principally we are the advisor to the president on telecommunications and information matters. That role has evolved to also include a number of internet-related functions as the world of communications has evolved. So we also engage pretty heavily with international agencies on internet policy, including our role as the U.S. government's representative to ICANN for the domain name system. We also are the federal government's regulator of spectrum. So what the FCC does for commercial licenses, NTIA does for federal assignments. And those are sort of the three core jobs that we do: advise on policy, spectrum management for the federal government, and internet issues for the domain name system. But in between those sort of three poles, there's a world of other options that we exercise along the way.
Last year you opened a proceeding on consumer privacy, and you got a lot of comments. Tell us about what you found. What are people saying about consumer privacy?
Sure. Well, I mean, it's no surprise to anybody who works in this space, but is an American in general, that the privacy landscape has changed over time. And we've reached a point now, in light of changes in the legal environment, particularly what happened with our colleagues implementing the GDPR in Europe, and California choosing to take what was looking to be a referendum or ballot initiative and move it into law. The Trump administration decided to take a hard look at our situation, and the White House asked NTIA to take a look at finding a way to have both privacy and prosperity. And I think it's important that we stress that this administration doesn't believe you have to sacrifice one for the other, that you can have privacy and prosperity. They are not mutually exclusive. And given the changes in the world, take a hard look at the US landscape and say, what are we doing right? What can we be doing better? What are people saying about the US and our stance on privacy? And so we put out a request for comment last year. We received 200 comments back, which by NTIA standards is a lot. For us to get 200 comments written, and these aren't off-the-cuff comments. These are well-written, well-thought-out contributions to our process, and we got 200 of them back. We saw a couple themes emerge from what got back to us. The first theme was that there is a real desire for there to be leadership at the federal level on this, and that means taking a look at doing something that would preempt a patchwork of state laws. on this issue. The second theme that we saw emerge was a desire to see us continue to empower the Federal Trade Commission. This administration has said for years, and certainly the administrations before us have said the same thing because it's true, the Federal Trade Commission has been the world's biggest protector of privacy. By volume, by their efforts to take actions on behalf of consumers, they've been the best regulator in the world. And we certainly want to continue to see them in that role. So that was what we saw come out from those comments also, that folks want us to see the FTC empowered to do their jobs in this space, in a modern digital environment. And the last theme that we saw come out of this was that we need to look at a risk-based and outcome-based model for privacy. Anyone who's ever traveled to Europe or gone to a website that originates in Europe has had to click the cookie button. I accept the cookies. It's sort of notice and consent taken to reductio ad absurdum, right? Everyone's going to click yes. Notice and consent has a place in the pantheon of options for privacy, but what we heard from commenters is they're really interested in seeing us take a hard look at how to differentiate between the quantity, the quality, the scope, the scale of data, and provide the kinds of tools people need to make smart decisions. That work is being handled by our sister agency, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, NIST, out in Montgomery County. They're working right now, and they're holding their second workshop on this in Georgia in the first week of May. They're working on trying to come up with a risk-based framework that companies can apply as they're looking at how to manage data. And it's very similar to the concept that they undertook with the cybersecurity framework. How do you assess your level of risk? And then given that assessment, what are some of the tools you can use to act appropriately, to take the appropriate level of safeguards given the risk? Privacy doesn't lend itself to a monolithic answer, so we think that framework that NIST is working on could be a real beneficial tool for folks who are trying to figure out how exactly do I go about managing this level of risk in a world where data is so ubiquitous.
What are the next steps? Where do we go from here?
So we're working right now, as I mentioned, NIST is working on their piece, and we're working on ours. So within the Department of Commerce alone, we're trying to make sure we're harmonizing our efforts. And there's a robust interagency process also where we have conversations with other parts of the federal government that have equities in this space. Turns out we're not the only ones that have smart ideas on these issues, and so we're consulting with other agencies and certainly with the White House as well, since they're the ones who asked us to do the work in the first place. So we're trying to bring that all together and come up with an administration position or something along those lines, and the White House will decide how we want to move forward.
Do you see this requiring legislation, or is this something that can be done under existing law?
I mean, if you take the sort of three frames that I put out there, the three pillars that people have expressed an interest in, I mean, certainly preemption requires a federal law. State preemption would require legislation. But that doesn't mean some of the other work we're doing doesn't continue regardless of whether or not there's legislation. I think the work that NIST is doing on a framework for privacy is going to be beneficial whether or not there's a change in law, whether or not California goes into effect. Having those kinds of tools is a net positive, and the work that NIST is doing is really going to be helpful for particularly small companies. I mean, we're not terribly concerned about big companies figuring out how to cope with a regulatory regime. If you're a large multinational company, you figured out how to internalize the costs of regulation. It's small and medium-sized enterprises that we're really concerned about. How do they cope with an all-encompassing regime like GDPR and do so in a way that doesn't just lead them to say, I'm going to cut myself off from parts of the internet because the juice isn't worth the squeeze?
We have GDPR from Europe. We have California in 2020. It's going to be implementing their privacy law. It's a very confusing world, isn't it?
Yeah. And as is typically argued in these spaces, when you have a patchwork quilt, smart general counsels will tell you, manage to the most stringent. And that's what we heard from commenters as well, is if you end up with this race to see who's going to be the most stringent, effectively what you're doing is you're letting individual states continue to set policy for the entire United States. That was the rationale that we got from our commenters for why they're having a national framework, a preemptive law in the first place would make sense. We're all for finding innovative ways to secure privacy. But again, the comments we got back were, let's find a way to incentivize the market to do that. Let's find a way for us to make privacy something that people can compete on. as opposed to something that is mandated.
Let's talk a bit about supply chain security, which I know is something that you all have been working on at NTIA. Tell us about supply chain security and where you see that going.
I mean, it's a real problem. And it's not just the Department of Commerce that is concerned about this. I think you've seen this entire administration take a real whole of administration approach to expressing our concern that as we look at the telecommunications supply chain, we want to make sure that we are ensuring that we have the best equipment in this country. And as we look across the manufacturers, we've been very fortunate that our 4 largest wireless providers have chosen to strike deals for their 5G equipment with companies that are based in countries with the rule of law, with an independent judiciary, and that don't have a cybersecurity law that expressly states they're going to ask companies in their country to engage in intelligence gathering. And so, you know, it's a pretty straightforward look for us to draw a line from A to B. And we've been fortunate that our largest providers have gone that direction. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't continue to work with our allies to ensure that there remains a market for secure technologies, for technologies that are coming from countries that share our values, that share the rule of law, that share an independent judiciary. And that's one of the things we've really been pushing on. Look, it's no surprise, given what was in the National Defense Authorization Act a few years ago and the commentary that's been coming from other parts of the government, that we have concerns about Huawei. And Huawei is, in fact, suing the U.S. government because of our concerns, right? They're suing over the NDAA provisions in I believe, Texas. We're going to continue to have those concerns. And I think it's healthy for us to have concerns that when you're looking at a technology that is so ubiquitous to life in the United States, it's hard to imagine an interaction in your day that doesn't involve the exchange of data. And those networks shouldn't be inherently suspect.
Speaking of 5G, this has been a great topic. Just yesterday, right here, we had a conference on 5G. Tell us your perspective on 5G and where the U.S. is right now on 5G deployment and where it fits in the global environment.
So I think it's pretty safe to say we are in the race with others. And like any race, the race is determined by how you figure out the metrics. I know a lot has been made of the amount of spectrum that other countries are making available. A lot has been made of the number of towers that are being built in other countries. I don't view those as the metrics that will determine our success. I think as you look at 5G for us, I look at it and I say, what are the things we're doing to empower American consumers? And how is this helping drive prosperity, productivity? The FCC and NTIA are both doing a lot of work to make sure that the policies of this country promote investment in these technologies. And I think as we look at it, when we looked at 4G, I don't think anybody thought, oh, LTE, this will disrupt the taxi cab industry, or LTE, this will disrupt any of the other industries that the app economy is built on. I'm really looking forward to seeing what 5G drives. Is 5G going to be principally driving better agriculture? Well, that's in the discussion. Is 5G going to be helping us drive autonomous vehicles? That's in the discussion, right? The greater throughput and the lower latency that these technologies will provide is a game changer in terms of enabling other things. So I'm reticent to think of 5G as an end unto itself. It's a means to other innovative ends. And we won't know what those are yet until the innovators start figuring out what they can do with the platform.
What are the things that concern you most about deployment of 5G at this point?
Well, supply chain integrity is one of them. I mean, that's certainly something that is a concern for all of us and should be a concern for all of us. And that feeds into the larger data security and privacy debate, right? I mean, those are the things that you can't have true privacy unless you have data security, right? Building privacy on an inherently insecure network is a bit of a challenge, to say the least. And those kinds of issues are definitely intertwined and things that I'm concerned about. But with respect to 5G in particular, I think what we have to be on the lookout for in terms of things that could go off the rails is just the fact that the spectrum environment is so much more congested that we're having to make tougher decisions. As we've moved CMRS up into the millimeter waves, we're having to make different calculations about how close can we put services together. We no longer have the luxury of making, and I use this term loosely, easy spectrum decisions. We can't simply neighborhood services and say, well, that's fine, the terrestrial guys will stay down here, the satellite guys will stay up here. That luxury is gone at this point. As we move into an area where we're going to increasingly have contentious relationships between competing spectrum uses, I think making sure we get those decisions right, because it's hard to unwind a bad spectrum decision, is one of the things that I'm most concerned about.
Speaking of which, 3.5 band, CBRS, I know that's something that NTIA has been working on, testing on that. Tell us about that.
It's really exciting. CBRS, for those that aren't familiar, the 3.5 band is a band that is used on the federal side primarily by naval radar systems. And these are systems that help aircraft carriers land jets. So this is not a trivial usage of the spectrum. This is life and death, go no go kind of decisions that get made using this band. That being said, what happened is the FCC tried to find a way, and working with NTIA, and in particular in this case the Air Force and the Navy, try to find ways to make them work together in a way that we haven't done before. So CBRS is principally controlled by two systems. One is called the Spectrum Access System. The other one is called the Environmental Sensing Capability. And the notion here is that the highest use of the spectrum is to make sure that we are landing aircraft safely. But that when you're not using it for that, that's just dead weight loss. Every millisecond you're not using it, it's just dead weight loss in the spectrum. So how do you get more out of that? Well, you provide a set of rules where people can use it as long as their device is capable of being shut off the moment you need access to it for a critical use. ESC testing is done. SAS system testing is going on. Those are both happening at our lab in Boulder, Colorado, the Institute for Telecommunications Sciences. We're very excited about the work that's happening. We're hopeful that we'll be done with those soon. It's important for people to remember, though, this is a complex system engineering problem. So you can't test one system in isolation and not test it with the other. So as we get these things moving together, the ESC and the SAS have to work cooperatively for this to work. And that's the stage we're at, is trying to figure out how to make these systems work together so we can send it back to the FCC and say, we're comfortable with these, let's light this up.
Other spectrum management issues that you're working on that the staff is really focused on?
Yeah, we're in the middle of the National Spectrum Strategy, which is actually a really exciting time for us. President Trump put out a presidential memorandum last year asking us to take a hard look at spectrum use and figure out a strategy going forward. And anyone who's worked in this space for a significant period of time knows each president, the last few presidents, has come in and immediately rescinded the presidential memoranda from the previous president and put their own stamp on spectrum policy. That's been great to date. Each president has had their own individual initiatives, and it's worked out. We have one of the most enviable spectral environments in the world. That being said, President Trump wanted us to try and move beyond that. And so the memorandum asks us to put in place a strategy, and one that we hope will be persistent, that can be built on rather than rescinded by the next president. And that is really a forward-looking, how do we address the ongoing concerns that we need more spectrum for commercial uses, whether they be commercial licensed or commercial unlicensed? And how do we also look forward at federal spectrum needs? We've been running a playbook in this country where we constantly ask federal users to do more with less or to do the same with less. And that's worked so far. And again, sort of the neighborhooding of spectrum was a luxury that we were able to take advantage of. Those days are largely gone. At this point, we're trying to figure out, okay, what do our needs look like going forward? We asked the agencies for 15 years worth of forward-looking data. And in spectrum time, 15 years is an eternity. Unless you're a broadcaster, 15 years is an eternity. And so it really caught people by surprise, but it was our way of saying, look, we want to be able to forecast what you're going to need going forward and make sure we're adjusting accordingly. We're in the data gathering process on that, so we'll get more information back from our agencies and be able to incorporate that. But we're really trying to take a look and say, we're not going to go band by band anymore. What are the kinds of principles on which we can rest ourselves for the next couple of decades that will adapt to the changing spectrum environment?
And what's the time frame on this project?
The President gave us a deadline of this summer, and I don't see any move to extend it. So we're working to meet the President's deadline.
And then after you get this summer to have everything complete, or just the data gathered, or
have all the information processed and a strategy sent over to the White House.
Wow.
So no rest for the weary.
That's great.
My Spectrum team is a very dedicated bunch. They're working very hard. And by the way, that goes for the folks in every one of the federal agencies that are Spectrum users. We're a small, very dedicated group of federal employees who love what we do. I mean, Spectrum is one of those issues that no one had heard of outside of, wireless services. No one in the general population had heard of 15 years ago. When I went home, and my parents, who I love dearly but are not technology people, said to me, "What's this Spectrum stuff you're working on?" And I said, "Okay, this is hit the mainstream," when my parents asked me about it.
That's actually a very good measure. And what did you tell them?
This was a long, with several cups of coffee conversation. Yeah, so coffee, mind you.
Well, something that your parents probably understand, and I think a lot of people do, is issues related to public safety and some things that I know that NTI has been involved jointly with the FCC. Firstnet comes to mind. Tell us about what's going on there.
Firstnet is really exciting. It's an exciting part of the work we do. Those that aren't familiar, in 2012, the Middle Class Tax Relief and Job Creation Act had provisions that required us to establish a national public safety broadband network. And that meant reaching out to the commercial side and finding a commercial partner to work with on getting a network out there that would provide first responders with a broadband network with priority and preemption. We signed a 25-year contract with AT&T a few years ago, and AT&T has been working with us cooperatively since then to not only make their commercial network available with priority and preemption for first responders, but to build out the 700 megahertz D block, which was the spectrum that was put in as a public safety band by Congress when they created Firstnet. We are now, 2012, the legislation was signed, so we are just now 7 years in. It was February 22nd was their 7th birthday. I'm really pleasantly surprised with how things have been going. I don't think anyone at the time expected things to be moving this quickly. We just got back from being down in Mississippi for a board meeting where the Firstnet group was down there to sign an MOU with the University of Mississippi Medical Center to be the network that helps provide connectivity between rural first responders and the expertise that they have in more urban parts of Mississippi. We're excited about that partnership. We think it's really going to provide a great framework for getting information about how this network can help provide rural America with the kind of life-saving information they need when they need it. And it's going to be an ongoing push. I mean, it's a long-term project. A 25-year lease is a long-term project, and we're just now in the very early stages. So exciting progress, but there's a lot more to come.
Related to that, advanced D911 services?
Still an ongoing project, right? It's unfortunate, but there are parts of this country that are not up to speed on E911, let alone moving and looking forward to next generation 911. So we are currently in the process of grants. Same legislation, middle class tax relief, provided a $110 million grant program that is jointly administered by NTIA and NHTSA, the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration. And we are in the process of distributing money under those grants. And those grants are designed to help communities get caught up on 911 technology. It's unfortunate, but what we have is you have consumers who are carrying smartphones. Thanks to the wireless industry, you have first responders who are carrying smartphones, thanks to Firstnet and others. And in between, you have public safety answering points that are not capable of handling the amount of information that you could connect between the two of them. That should be fixed. We really do, as a country, need to take a hard look at whether or not we're providing all the tools we need to make sure our first responders have what they need.
You've had a chance to travel around the country a bit as Assistant Secretary. Probably seen some things that you found remarkable, surprising. Tell us a bit about some of the things you've seen in your travels as Assistant Secretary.
So it's been interesting. I've done a lot of international travel also, but I would say domestically, this trip to Mississippi was one of the most eye-opening experiences of my time in this job. It was really stunning to watch how they could take the series of technologies that they have access to and stitch them together into a cohesive first response team. So the university was kind enough to set up a demonstration for us of how they would handle a hostage situation in a rural community. And so it was a demonstration of how a SWAT team would use communications to get in and out, how they would relay back medical information. They have mobile units that are capable of connecting to our network and providing all of that information back to a hospital. That seamless handoff between them and the unit, the air unit that comes in to fly someone back to the care they need and how they can keep that going. That, for me, being able to see what we do in Washington, we spend a lot of time on policy. Rarely do we have the opportunity to get out into a community and actually see how that's being put into practice. And so being able to see that was one of the more interesting things I've gotten to see as part of this job.
You said internationally as well. Tell us about that.
Internationally, I've been doing a lot of work to talk about 5G and having a chance to meet with our counterparts from other countries. What is striking is that in some ways we are facing the same challenges, and in some ways they're really trying to see what America's lead is going to be. I can't tell you how many countries I've had conversations with asking us, so how did you make Firstnet a reality? Can you walk us through that? Because it doesn't seem intuitive. And frankly, when you walk folks through what the legislation does, I think there's a large amount of misunderstanding about exactly how the legislation was trying to promote Firstnet in the first place. Firstnet's governing statute was about market creation. I mean, it's trying to make a user base of 1 to 3 million people be attractive enough to move the needle with a country that's looking at a 300 million person market. Typically, you can't drive changes to supply chain. You can't drive changes to user interface based on 1 million users. But Firstnet was able to do that. That statute made a carrier, in this case AT&T, that has a national scope and international reach, care enough to make changes to their supply chain to bring the kind of technology into the hands of first responders that we needed. And when you look at it from that perspective, all of a sudden people's eyes open up and they say, oh, I get it. I get how you guys did what you did. That's been really interesting for me as well.
Broadband. Broadband USA.
Yes.
Has a nice ring to it.
It does.
Tell us about Broadband USA.
So Broadband USA is the group within NTIA that is working with both to service the grant programs that were originally part of our mandate over the last decade, but also to do outreach and to bring together state and local broadband leaders across the country. And now they've inherited the broadband mapping project that Congress has put on us. I'd like to take a minute to talk about both the mapping, but also the State Broadband Leaders Network, because it's something we're really proud of. Coming out of the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, there was a lot of involvement with the states because we were distributing $4.7 billion. States take notice when you have that kind of grant-making authority. But that money has long since been distributed. Mm-hmm. Even though we're no longer making grants under that program, the State Broadband Leaders Network persists. And I think it's a testament to not only the staff at NTIA who work every day to make sure that it stays up and running and a forum for good ideas, but the people in state capitals and in county seats and in local government who have said, this is so important to me, I want to keep doing this. I'm going to dedicate my time to this forum and make sure that we're learning as much as we can from each other and sharing as many issues as we can. It really has proven to be a great place for exchange of ideas. And it served as the bedrock of how we made decisions about the broadband mapping program. So in Congress, 2 appropriations bills ago in fiscal 18 gave us $7.5 million for broadband mapping. We said, okay, $7.5 million, got it. The last time we did this, we had hundreds of millions. We're going to have to make some tough decisions. So the first job for us was, let's get a platform. So we worked and we're excited. We've put out a contract and we're now in the process of standing up a cloud-based platform that'll be able to take in data to produce a broadband availability map that is updated. But $7.5 million wasn't going to be enough to do that and start buying commercial data sets. And frankly, we're not a commercial regulator. So unlike the FCC, who can use 477 to get data out of its regulated entities, we do not have that luxury. And so instead, we had to say, which states are best poised to help us get the most bang for our buck. And so we took a lot of time to figure out which ones are actively involved in doing this, which states are already doing some of this work, and how can we incorporate that right off the bat. And so we picked 8 states. Please don't ask me to rattle them off because I'll invariably forget one. But we picked 8 states right out of the gate to say, okay, thank you for all the work you've been doing with us on state broadband leaders. Thank you for the leadership you've shown in your own states. What can you bring to the table? Let's show what we can do. Fiscal 19 appropriations also had money, so we're looking at how to expand that group and how to bring in commercial data sets with that money to produce as great a tool as we can for policymakers. Because too often, as we are looking at where do we have broadband challenges, we get this grant money and we say, great, we want to provide more broadband in more places. And we get asked, where don't we have broadband? And we say, well, we're going to have to look a bunch of different places, and it's not necessarily going to be the best data. We want to try to solve that problem.
Great. Well, I could sit up here asking questions all day, but that would not be fair to our audience, and I know they've got a lot of questions to ask you as well. So there are folks here with microphones who will be happy to assist people who have questions, and please identify yourself and your affiliation, and we'll start with the gentleman here up front.
Alton Ergen, I'm from ECM, Fund Management Company. I wanted to ask you about the C-band alliance, which is promoting for 5G to pick up rather fast, a process for that C-band to be auctioned to wireless companies. How do you see that happening? Do you see that happening? What do you think the auction process is going to be? You talked about satellite spectrum and the wireless spectrum. How do you manage this thing? They propose 100 megahertz, but it can go up to 400 megahertz if you do the right technical improvements on the ground. How do you vision this taking place? Because they say that this is necessary for the United States to catch up rather fast on the 5G. Do you believe that?
So I think it's important to note right out of the gate that that's a non-federal allocation. That's the FCC's world. They are the ones that are addressing that. So as a regulator, that's not really my space. There's no federal allocation there. But as an advisor, we've looked at it. I think perhaps one of the most interesting things for me about what's going on with the C-band alliance is that what we have for the first time is a set of licensees coming forward and saying, actually, we have some room. We might be willing to sell. That doesn't generally happen in spectrum policy, right? I mean, we have the broadcast incentive auction, but that was mandated by legislation. We don't typically find licensees coming forward saying, I have extra spectrum and I'm willing to sell. I think that's the most interesting thing about this entire process. There's a lot of work that the FCC is doing on that front, and I don't pretend to be privy to all of it. And I'm sure they're going to move forward in a thoughtful way. But I think for me, that was the most stunning part of the C-band alliance coming together, is that the change in the way people are thinking about spectrum is that they're thinking about it as a strategic asset in ways that it wasn't always thought of.
Adam Powell here in the front.
Adam Powell from the University of Southern California. There seem to be a number of forces taking advantage of greater connectivity to actually divide. I'm not talking about Russia, I'm not talking about the Chinese firewall, but Europe with copyright, a judge in Australia on coverage of the trial there. These things reach into the US, and people here and in New York and in other parts of the US have to make decisions on how they're going to actually divide their distribution in ways that perhaps had not been considered 5-10 years ago. Is that something that is part of what you're considering?
So it's not an issue we've looked at in particular. I think as we look in general at the internet, right, we're seeing a host of issues that took place in a non-internationally interconnected world become issues that we have to address in an internationally interconnected world. It's not like the content industry is new to the notion of controlling where they're distributing content or where they're making things available. The complication is that they had complete control over it before, and the internet has made it slightly more challenging. These are the things we're going to have to live with in an interconnected world, right? We want to be able to have access to as much information as possible, but that doesn't mean that there aren't limits and that there won't be a constant back and forth between ideologies around the world on this, right? You know, we see this play out, frankly, when we hear talk about putting ethics rules in place for AI, right? Just as I've said this about the AI ethics rules before, which is it's hard to take the concept of ethics and say it's universal. In this case, it sounds like you're talking about something that is akin to what we saw with the decency rules in broadcasting in the United States, right? We've always relied on it to be a local standard, right? What is acceptable to the community? And I don't think that's going to be different going forward on the internet. It's just the communities may be getting larger and more diverse.
Gentleman over here.
Hi, Howard Busker, Communications Daily. So there's been a lot of questions lately about protections for passive systems, and particularly because of the FCC is looking at spectrum above 95 gigahertz, and as you know, there's like 10 big chunks of spectrum up there that where there's a lot of protections. Do you see that evolving? I mean, what's sort of, how do you see that unfold? I mean, and do you think, is that something that's going to get a harder look? Are there going to be ways to maybe make those protections, you know, so you don't have just a blanket, you can't, you know, transmit in these frequencies?
Sure. I mean, look, Howard, the thing that's great about spectrum policy, and this is why I love this field, I was incredibly lucky to have ended up in this space because it wasn't a foregone conclusion, is that it changes constantly. If you had been asking 2 years ago about CMRS and the millimeter wave bands, I would have been like, yeah, we're not there, come on. When it comes to above 95, in a lot of ways, we're talking largely theoretical. But the one thing that we're going to have to look at going forward, and this comes back to what I said earlier, is spectrum decisions are going to be increasingly complicated. Our demands on systems are going to be more and more. We're packing more systems in, yes, to more spectrum when we start talking about spectrum frontiers and spectrum horizons, into more spectrum. But the systems are still going to be packed cheek by jowl and have the needs they need. As we look forward, the thing that we say about passive systems around our office is like, we don't have to choose between passive systems and being first in 5G. We don't have to choose between passive systems and active systems. We can have our cake and eat it too, but it's going to take a lot of hard engineering work. And in the case of some of these bands that are particularly high, some theoretical physics. But that's what we do in this country. We take new ideas, we work hard, we try to figure out ways to make them work, and we innovate. I don't see this space being any different.
Gentleman here.
Hi, Shin Oya from Japan Bank International Corporation, and I have a question about the 5G issue. And I understand that the National Defense Authorization Act 2019 excluded or prohibited that the federal government purchase, for example, Huawei. And as you mentioned that, I mean, large network provider is not purchasing here in the US from Huawei, but there is a demand from the small provider. So I heard that your government is considering executive order clearly prohibited that network provider can use that Huawei or GT kind of things. So my first question is, I would like to know the status of this executive order, what is the status and what can be timing, this is number one. And second question is, I mean, European attitude towards 5G or Huawei. And I think maybe yesterday Europe decided that they are not necessarily getting along with the United States. And by end of probably June, individual European government decides risk or evaluate and carry out assessment kind of things. So what's your view on this?
Sure. So with respect to your first question, I'm not going to comment on sort of the internal deliberations of the executive branch. That's it's not my job to get out in front of the White House. But all that being said, to your second question, we're actually pleasantly surprised to see that we're starting to see the messaging that we have in terms of our concern. And that concern is manifested in a lot of ways in the NDAA provision that you noted, that our European counterparts are expressing similar concern. We're seeing that out of Brussels. We're seeing it out of Germany. We're seeing it out of the UK, that there is a real concern that as we look at supply chain integrity and the quality of the equipment that is being put into our networks, that we take into account the level of risk involved in each individual purchasing decision. And no, not every piece of equipment is the most sensitive piece of equipment in your country. But that's what we're seeing from our European counterparts, is they're taking a thoughtful approach to how to deal with the prevalence of Huawei equipment already in their networks and their future regulatory environment. So we're going to keep working with them. I know my State Department colleagues are doing the same thing. We're going to keep doing the outreach to our like-minded countries to let them know what our concerns are and to hear their feedback, because we're not the only country in the world that's grappling with this.
Ms. Warren.
Jennifer Warren, Lockheed Martin. The White House National Space Council has issued several space policy directives, one of them being Space Policy Directive 2, which focused on the importance of international spectrum for space and satellite systems. I know there was a report released yesterday in response to one of those directives with recommendations. Could you speak to some of those recommendations, maybe highlight what you think are the most impactful or meaningful of the dozen or more that are in there?
Sure. Way to be topical, Jennifer. Thank you. It came out yesterday. So the Space Policy Directive 2 report that came out yesterday does have a number of provisions in it. And this was done in response to the presidential directive to take a look at these issues. Among the ones I think that are the most impactful and the ones I think we're most interested in focusing on is particularly focusing on making sure our NASA colleagues have the resources they need. NASA has a hefty mission in front of it in terms of communication to and from space, and those communications are incredibly difficult to deal with. And we deal with it in satellite communications, as you're well aware, because we're dealing with the power differential between getting something that can be orbital back to the United States or back to wherever the station is that's listening to it. That's exacerbated as you get further and further from the planet. And you have the same problem that you can only put so much in orbit in terms of power and signal generation, but you're putting it further and further from the planet as you go to the moon, as you go to Mars, as you go beyond. And so making sure that we are providing a place for the United States to continue to be a leader in space communications is something that's very important to Secretary Ross. I know it's something that's very important to the president, and it's something that we're happy to be a supporter of. And I think what you see is almost all of the recommendations in SPD2 in that report that we put out are focused on making sure we're empowering that space commerce mission, making sure that the U.S. is at the forefront of having the best launch industry, the best satellite industry, taking care of orbital debris concerns, all of the things that Secretary Ross has really made a priority, so much so that as many of you know, he moved the Office of Space Commerce out of NOAA and into the Secretary's office to give it a place of more prominence. We're very excited to support them. We think the report yesterday is a great part of that work.
Building on that, just can you, without getting into the specific deliberations, can you talk about coordination among different federal agencies on communications policy?
It's funny. I used to work on Capitol Hill, as you noted in our opening. And on Capitol Hill, you've got 435 House offices, and you only really have to coordinate with the ones that are on your committee or the ones that are in leadership. You let the system work the rest of them. In the executive branch, it's very different. You are, in many ways, dealing with a lot of equals. And communications policy is something that touches on literally every part of the U.S. government. I have yet to find the part of the U.S. government that has no stake in communications and information policy. So we spend a lot of our time working the interagency process, making sure we've talked to our counterparts at other agencies, making sure we're working to represent their interests, which can be at cross purposes. And so occasionally we have to be the ones to try to resolve the challenges. And we do that in coordination with our White House colleagues. We do that in coordination with our front office colleagues from the Secretary's office. But ultimately, a lot of that falls to NTIA to do the coordination. It's a daunting task. I have to say it is much more complicated than I appreciated when I was a Capitol Hill staffer. The things I know now about how the executive branch runs would have made me a much better Hill staffer. But it's a really enjoyable process. You learn things about your own government you didn't know. You learn things about the way we use communications that you would never have considered, because we find ourselves in our own little communications policy bubble. Sometimes we forget about the real world consequences of these things. We filed, a while ago, we filed a letter with the FCC talking about the transition from copper to fiber, and how some of our concern was based on the fact that federal agencies take time to replace systems. And it's not always done quickly. And some of these systems are very remote, they're old, and as long as they work, there's no reason to replace them. We have to take those things into consideration as we look at the march of technology, right? The march of technology waits for no one, but that doesn't mean we can't try to slow it down a little bit.
Well, and with that, I know I can't slow down the clock, and I know we need to get you back to your office to work. So please join me in thanking Secretary Redl for joining us today.
Thanks so much. Appreciate this.